Okay, I'm going to welcome all of the people who are here in person, and also all the people who are watching live on video cam. And we've had a great deal of interest in this topic and in the author. And then those people who can watch it on YouTube anytime afterwards. Today I'm particularly pleased to interview Jon and talk about Janet Yellen, whom I have met several times in the store and have liked her from the beginning. So today we're going to hear about Yellen, the trailblazing economist who navigated an era of upheaval. So Janet Yellen is the only person who has held the top 3 economic positions in this country. She was the chair of the Council for Economic Advisors under Clinton. She was the chair of the Federal Reserve under Obama, and she is now Secretary of the Treasury under Biden. Now, there was a female, Laura Tyson was chair of the Economic Advisors before. I think she was the only other woman.
She was the first woman, and then Yellen was the second after her.
So Janet is the first woman to be in 2 of those positions. She's married, interestingly, to George Akerlof, a prize-winning economist who sits in that chair and reads while when she comes to shop, and gives a positive answer when she asks him a question. And she is the mother of Robert Akerlof, who also gives his mother very good advice. It's been interesting.
And is also an economist.
Yes, he's also an economist, very well-regarded economist. So Janet has been very prescient. One of our customers, Rita McGrath, has written a book called Seeing Around Corners. And Janet has seen around corners and predicted a lot of things that did in fact come to pass. Not 100%, nobody's 100%, particularly as it relates to economics. But she has done that based on a great deal of research and preparation and about the effects of economic policy, and she's helped lead the country through some very, very turbulent times economically. Now, Jon is a senior writer for the Wall Street Journal, and I happened to pick up the paper one Saturday morning, and the first thing I do on Saturday morning, we take 4 papers, is go to the review section of the Wall Street Journal, because I think that's the most interesting. And there was an article about this book. So I immediately got his email address and reached out to him. Anyway, he's a Pulitzer Prize finalist for his coverage of the Federal Reserve. He's was on the Wall Street Journal team that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2009 for coverage of the financial crisis. And he contributed to on-the-ground reporting for the Wall Street Journal's 9/11 coverage that did win a Pulitzer Prize. His colleagues have twice voted him one of the nation's most influential financial journalists. And he's nonpartisan, and he's been on all the talk shows and all, from CNBC to Fox to PBS. He graduated from Duke University and Columbia University. So this book is 2 books in one. It is a book about Janet Yellen and George Akerlof and their partnership, but it's also what I call macroeconomics 201. I mean, it is really a great summary of the major forces that have shaped economic policy in the last 30 years in this country. So, and it's an easy read for people who are not economists who can become very obtuse, I think. So it's really 2 books in one. So first I want you to tell us, what about Janet's background that has prepared her for or shaped her views of the world and her approach to problem solving?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me here. When Nina reached out to me, I, of course, knew you and knew your name and how important your work is to Janet. So I immediately responded, and I raced over here and brought her 2 copies of the book, because I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you and this dialogue. So Let me start out broadly, and then I'll get to answering the question about what prepared her for these jobs. I'll say what drew me to this story. I mean, we think about economics as these really kind of abstract terms and complicated, but what drew me to this particular story was Janet Yellen and her relationships and her family, really. She's married to a Nobel Prize winner. They have an incredibly interesting kind of family dynamic. And her personal story, the narrative of her own family growing up, is also an important part of her story, which leads me to the answer to your question of like what prepared her for these jobs. I would say a very difficult mother. So her mother was very demanding. She grew up in Brooklyn in the 1950s, and her mom was a perfectionist who expected Yellen and her brother John not only to get their homework done every night, but for it to be done correctly. So Yellen's mother, Ruth, checked their homework every night, and they weren't allowed to leave the table until everything was marked as being correct. She was a retired school teacher herself, and so I think it made Yellen a person first and foremost who's focused on preparation. She is almost compulsive about never being in a meeting unprepared for what might come her way. Even today, as Treasury Secretary, she gets briefing books of 200 to 300 pages in length on weekends, comes back on Monday and has questions for her staff about what's on page 137. So she's very focused on preparation, almost to the point of being compulsive about it. There's a picture in the book of, she was famous for notes she took for James Tobin, who was the leading light of the Yale economics department when she was getting a PhD. And these notes look like, the diagrams she writes look like architectural renderings. She would stay up late into every night with very meticulous note-taking that everybody else wanted to have to get them through his economics classes.
So if you can summarize her education, right, her path, and how a woman succeeded in a mostly male-dominated world of economists. I went online to look up the percentage of female economists, and I found a site that had percentages by country. The U.S. is number 46 out of 71 countries in this study of female economists as a percentage. And it's interesting, it's only 22%, which is of economists are women, and that really fits very closely into the percentage of women who are in the C-suite, which is 24%. There's now 29% of women on board. So it's almost as if somebody has said, okay, here's a limit. So how did she do that?
Yeah, her path, her educational path is actually, it's a window into first how much has really changed for women over the last 50 or 60 years, but also how much progress still needs to be made. So she grew up in Brooklyn. She went to public school in Brooklyn. When she went into high school, the best male students went to Stuyvesant. I don't think it was taking female women at the time. She went through public school to Fort Hamilton High School. When it came time, excuse me, to choose colleges, her choices were fairly narrow. She was a straight A student all through high school, valedictorian, editor of the school newspaper, impeccable record. But Yale didn't accept women. Princeton didn't accept women. Let me see, what were some of the other Ivy League schools at the time?
Harvard,
Brown had a sister school, Pembroke, which did accept women. Columbia, I'm not sure if Columbia, I don't think, no, she didn't want to be.
Hunter.
Hunter,
Not
yeah.
Hunter, Barnard.
Barnard. Anyway, she had a limited number of choices. She ended up choosing Pembroke. Became very interested in economics and went on to Yale, to the Yale PhD program. She was the only woman in her Yale PhD class at a time in the late 1960s when Yale still was not accepting women as undergraduates. And there was the faculty meetings were held at a private club called Morey's, which also didn't allow women in. So the faculty club would have these meetings, and women weren't allowed to attend. When they did attend, they had to go in through a back entrance. So when she was there in the 1960s, there were a lot of protests, as the women's movement was kind of gaining force and steam. There were protests about how women were treated, and things were just starting to change. She went from Yale to Harvard to become an assistant professor. She was one of only 2 women on faculty. Now, to give you a sense of what Harvard was like at the time, this was like a stunning revelation for me. There was one pool on campus. The pool was men's only, and they swam naked in it. Just to give you a sense of what it was like to be, a woman at Harvard. She wasn't given tenure at Harvard. Very often they didn't give assistant professors tenure, but she found it difficult to find research partners as a young PhD right out of school, and she ended up leaving Harvard after 5 or 6 years. By the way, one of her early students was a young economist named Lawrence Summers, who ended up doing a few things. And then she came to the Fed and met George Akerlof, and her whole story changed. We could take it from there. But I think the point is, this was not a field in which women were expected to participate or particularly welcomed. It was a very argumentative field. People like to drown each other out in meetings. And Yellen, I talk about the preparation. She was driven by her mentor at Yale, Jim Tobin, to have a sense of purpose about her work, to see in economics beyond the math and the charts and the lines, that there were people underneath all of this work that they were trying to help. And I think that's really more than anything what drove her to succeed. Her tool was preparation, but her will came from a desire to use this skill set that she had, very gifted in math, very logical thinker, but to use that skill set to do something to improve the human lot. And I would say that's kind of what drove her beyond the obstacles that she faced along the way.
So to simplify, there's a lot of jokes about economists, and they're never right, and it's a messy field, and whatever. But to simplify, I would say that there are 2 schools of economic thought. Mm-hmm. One is Milton Friedman, Chicago school, which is markets will take care of themselves, the invisible hand, let capitalism work, and it'll reset itself when it needs to. Free market economists. The other is the Keynesian schools with Paul Samuelson and Jim Tobin,
right,
who believed that government had some role in the economic well-being for people, and that there really should be a role for government, that we shouldn't just leave it to the free markets. So how would you describe the difference between the 2 schools, and how Tobin influenced her thought?
Right. So her early years in economics, and I guess you could argue this entire period that I'm covering in the book, and kind of the reason why I zeroed in on Yellen and also her husband George Akerlof is because there has been this debate that has been raging since the Great Depression, even beyond that, about what is the role, the right mix of free markets and government intervention in managing our economy. So Keynes ruled the post-Great Depression era. The Depression was this long, horrific period of very high unemployment, and Keynes's view was that when the private sector stalls, the government has a role to play and when interest rates are very low, the government can have a role to play to spend and create investment to try to restart the engines of the economy that the private sector isn't restarting. Well, Milton Friedman came up behind Keynes, and interestingly, Friedman didn't start out as the Friedman we think of today. In fact, Milton Friedman, a lot of the great economists during World War II went and worked for the United States government. Friedman worked in the Treasury Department and designed the system of income tax withholding that we all live with now every day, because the government needed an efficient way to bring in tax revenue to fund the World War II buildup. And so we have the tax system we have today because of Milton Friedman, ironically. But anyway, he came to see that, or to believe that governments were moving too far in intervening in the economy, and he created a counter movement known as the Chicago School, in which the argument was that markets are best left to their own devices. And Jim Tobin, who was Yellen's mentor, and Paul Samuelson and others kind of pushed back against that. They thought that the government had a role to play. And Janet Yellen came up in the generation right after Tobin that was engaged in fighting this fight, in these intellectual debates about what is the right role of government in the economy. Now, in the 1970s, when Yellen was an assistant professor at Harvard and then later at the Fed, the Friedmanites were winning. You could argue they won because we had a period of very high inflation. We had a kind of backlash against government regulation that, interestingly, Jimmy Carter started to change with deregulation of airlines and other industries, and by putting Paul Volcker in place at the Fed. And Yellen and her husband, George Akerlof, were kind of engaged in kind of moving these debates about government versus markets forward. And they were on the Tobin and Friedman side. They were on the side that the government has to, you can't just take the government out of all economic activity. There has to be some role that it can play. And this gets back to, her relationship with Tobin, that economics can be used as a force for some good to improve the human lot. Milton Friedman felt the same thing, but he just didn't think the government should be a part of that. Tobin felt it should, and Yellen lined up behind him on that side of the argument.
So critical to her life and success was the meeting with George Akerlof.
Right.
So when did that happen, and how would you describe the partnership, and tell us a little bit more about George?
Okay, all right. George is a fascinating character, as I'm sure you've discovered when you've seen him kind of sitting here buried in his books. And then I imagine every now and then he'll pop his head up and say something that just fascinates you. George Akerlof wrote an article. Well, so he came up in the 1960s, and he was part of an elite class of young academics who were going through the MIT PhD program in the 1960s and later the 1970s. A lot of these people went on to win Nobel Prizes. Akerlof's view, he's a very unconventional thinker, and his view, looking at all of economics, not just the free market guys or the Keynesian guys, men and women, but all of economics, and he felt that they failed to understand that humans were underneath all of these systems, the market systems and the government systems, and that the models were a little too oversimplified. And so he wrote a paper based on the used car market. It was called The Market for Lemons. And the point of his paper was that these markets aren't as efficient as we make them out to be. That when you think about something like a used car, there's actually a lot of skepticism and deceit involved in the purchase of a used car that can make this particular market inefficient. For instance, the seller of a used car might know what's under the hood, that there's a belt that's fraying and could break at any time, and the buyer doesn't know as much about what's under the hood, and so there's skepticism about making the purchase, which affects the prices and the willingness of people to buy. Anyway, it became a famous paper because it showed in a very simple, elegant way that markets can be driven to kind of break down and inefficient. Akerlof showed up. He also liked to, he was, in his early years, he wandered around a lot. And he saw this wandering as a way of learning. So he goes from MIT to Berkeley, spends a couple of years there, decides he wants to go to India because he's got a lot of friends who are development economists, and they're interesting guys, and they like to stay up late into the night and talk. And so he goes, and he also thought he would learn something by spending some time. So he went to India, then went back to Berkeley, then came to Washington to work in Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors, which shocked his friends because he was like an anti-war protester, very liberal Keynesian kind of guy. Goes back to Berkeley, amidst all this wandering, he's written this brilliant paper, but he doesn't get a promotion to full professor, and is upset by that and says, I'm going to go to the London School of Economics, which offers him a position. But first I'm going to go back to Washington and spend a year at the Fed. So after all of these kind of and he was married and then divorced, married for a short period, divorced. So Yellen and Akerlof, Yellen is a person who is denied tenure at Harvard. Her mother is badgering her for years to get married. She hasn't met anyone who interests her enough to marry, and she says, I'm not just going to marry someone for the sake of marrying. So she's 30 years old when she shows up at the Fed. Akerlof has been everywhere, India, Washington, Berkeley. He's had disappointments and also some successes. And they meet at the Watergate Hotel at the going away party of a colleague. It wasn't love at first sight because Akerlof is too busy licking the icing off of the piece of a cake and doesn't really kind of engage when he meets Janet. They have a quick hello and then go different ways. A few days later, they find themselves at a talk in the cafeteria at the Fed, and they're sitting alone, these two nobodies who nobody really knows, in the cafeteria in the Fed, and they hit it off. And that was love at second sight. They start dating each other. Within a few weeks, decide to get married. And of course, there's a theory that they discuss as in their early discussions about whether to get married. So Yellen is a person who's one of these people who studies every problem from every possible angle, writes everything out, makes sure she's done all of her homework. Akerlof is more of a free thinker, and he says to her, you know, when you really know something, when you're really sure about something, you don't need to spend a lot of time going back and forth on it. You can just make the decision. And so she makes a very impetuous decision, and they decides to marry him, and 44 years later, they're still together.
That's amazing. So what are the main issues that she takes into consideration when she formulates policy? And can you talk about her sense of moral passion?
Right. Yeah, so moral passion is the idea that she got from Tobin that economics is meant to be used as a tool to improve the human condition, and that's really what drives her. And the other piece that she gets from Tobin is this commitment to a Keynesian way of thinking, that in making these calculations, the government, in her mind, intuitively ought to have some role to play to help the economy manage through downturns. Now, I'd have to say her experience in the coming 3 decades as a policymaker, and even as an academic at Harvard, was somewhat humbling because there have been lots of pitfalls along the way. In the 1970s, the White House, first under Lyndon Johnson and then under Richard Nixon, intimidated the Fed and badgered the Fed to keep interest rates low in the name of keeping unemployment low and keeping the economy growing. Really what Nixon and LBJ wanted to do was enhance their re-election prospects in 68 and 72. And the Fed overstimulated the economy, and it led to a lot of inflation, which is something that kind of comes back to where we are today. So, and there was an intellectual counter movement in the 1970s led by Milton Friedman and the Free Market School. It was called the Rational Expectations Movement. And the idea there was that the market is always going to be a step ahead of what the government does. And so, if the government might try to intervene to prevent a recession or speed up a recovery, but because people are going to anticipate what government officials do, it'll counteract whatever benefits might come from that. For instance, if there's a deficit spending program, the rational expectations view was that, well, people would see that we're running big deficits. They would think that as a result, their taxes will go up, so they'll pull back their spending instead of spending more to get the economy going. So at every step of the way, there's been this constant struggle, which we can come back to later, about how do we strike this balance between a democratically elected government and the efficient workings of a market-driven economy. It's really the story, it's the sub-story of her life that's been in the middle of almost every major debate of the last 60 years.
Now, you can't repeat exactly what she said, but one of the more illuminating things in your book was the discussion at the San Francisco Fed during the when she pounded the table.
Yeah, right.
Can you tell us generally what she said?
Am I not allowed to use the full quote?
No, I think you can.
We don't want it. Well, all right, I'll find out. So we had a financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and the leader at the Fed at the time was Ben Bernanke, who was a student of the Great Depression. Yellen had spent a lot of time studying the Great Depression herself and learning about it at her dining room table in Brooklyn as a child. And both felt that the Fed was complacent and ineffective during the Great Depression, allowed too many banks to fail, kept the money supply too tight, which ironically was also a view of Milton Friedman's. And so Bernanke, with Yellen's full support and encouragement, decided they had to move aggressively. And there was a meeting after the financial crisis was tamed. What Yellen saw, I think, kind of more clearly and articulated more forcefully than many others, was that, okay, so the financial crisis was over, but we have another crisis now, and the next crisis was high unemployment, and that unemployment was not going to come down quickly, that the economy was kind of stuck in part because the banking system wasn't creating credit anymore, and that if without engagement by the Fed, this was going to be a terrible recovery with high unemployment that caused a lot of suffering. And so she's sitting in a meeting with her economists as president of the San Francisco Fed, and they present her with projections for unemployment that show high unemployment for their years and years to come. And she gets very frustrated, and she pounds the table and she says, "These are effing people." And there was a young economist in the room, a woman named Mary Daly, who was kind of struck by how much conviction and passion Yellen had when she said this. And Yellen's message to them was that you're not doing enough. I need you to be doing more. I need more research. I need a better understanding of this situation so I can go and make a stronger case at Fed meetings in Washington. That was the moment. Mary Daly had kind of been wandering a bit herself as an economist and wondering what to do with her career. And that was a moment that kind of drove Mary Daly to see the purpose of what she was doing. She's now the president of the San Francisco Fed. So it had a big effect. That sense of conviction had a big effect on her.
So I'm going to go to a question that one of our colleagues has asked. It's Elizabeth DeZanis from Northern Trust in London.
Okay.
And she wanted to know, how does Janet lead, particularly in times of crisis or conflicting opinions, to bring consensus? While she likes to be prepared, what does she do when there's no time for preparation or the situation changes quickly? How do you navigate uncertainty?
Wow, that's a great question, and there's a lot to unpack there. I'll say to the first part, how does she lead? One of the lessons that I take from her story is a slight tweak of the saying "lean in," right? Who was it who said that?
Sheryl Sandberg.
Sheryl Sandberg.
Also a student at Harvard, I guess.
And a protege of Larry Summers.
Yeah, that's
So Sheryl Sandberg said lean in. What I take from Yellen's story is lean in when it matters. And by that, I mean, when the Fed was dealing with this very slow recovery and having these very intense debates in the post-crisis period about whether to do these programs, zero interest rates, near zero interest rates, quantitative easing, which is a bunch of bond buying programs, Yellen pushed her colleagues really hard, as kind of evidenced by this example that I gave you where she's pounding the table. You know, she followed, there's this one anecdote in the book of her following one of her colleagues into the garage at the Fed, Betsy Duke, when they were having a discussion about whether to launch one of these new bond buying programs. And Betsy Duke, she senses that Yellen's almost got tears in her eyes. She's got so much kind of passion about, Betsy was skeptical about doing this program. And Yellen pushed her very hard. So she leaned in debates where she felt that she had something important to say and it needed to be heard. But she didn't lean in just for the sake of leaning in. She didn't lean in just for the sake of being heard. Behind the scenes, I think people would describe her as a pretty easygoing person, a pretty relaxed person when she's not engaged in a debate that matters deeply, and she thinks that there's a direction that she needs to push it in. So, you know, there's examples in the book of her, you know, after a hard day's work at the Council of Economic Advisors with Alicia Munell. The CEA at the time was another place that was, I'm sorry, the White House in the 90s was another place seen by some as being a bit of a boys' club. And they'd have a long day, and Yellen would be like, let's just go have a martini. And they'd go out and pound a couple of drinks and have a few laughs. So, you know, she can relax when she feels it's a moment to relax. In this issue of crisis management, what do you do when you don't have time to prepare? Those could be moments that made her uncomfortable because she liked to be as prepared as possible. But I think what she's learned as a policymaker is you can't always be in the moment when you've done all of your homework. Sometimes you've got to make an answer right away. So an example of this was just a few months ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, and there was a big push by the Europeans for the world central banks to shut off the Russian central bank from the global financial system. And this push from the Europeans happened almost overnight. They were kind of skeptical that they were going to need to do sanctions at all because they didn't really think that Putin would go ahead and invade Ukraine. And then when he did, it was shocking to them. And in a matter of 48 hours, they decided they wanted to throw everything they possibly could in the form of sanctions against the Russian government. And so there was a Saturday morning where and this is all in the book, when the NSC went to President Biden and said, the Europeans want to do this, we have to do this right now. They hadn't even told Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, yet that they were going to do this. And she said, whoa, wait a second. We need to spend a little more time looking at this issue and the consequences. You know, it could have important effects on the dollar and the dollar's status as they were asking the United States to use our currency and our central bank as a weapon in this war. And she didn't just want to flip and make a decision right away. But they had until Monday morning, until Sunday night to make that decision. They couldn't, they wanted to do it, they felt they needed to do it by Sunday night before markets opened on Monday, because if they didn't, the Russians would be one step ahead of them and would have moved all of their money out of Western central banks and Western banks and into allied banks. So, she had to make a call with Jerome Powell, the Fed chairman, that Saturday morning. So, these can be kind of nerve-rattling moments, but she made the call. They sanctioned the central bank, and it caused a lot of turmoil in the Russian markets.
So next I want to talk about what the effects are of globalization, unemployment, inflation, the rise of greater income income disparity, and the social upheaval. And I want to use the apparel industry as an example. My first trip to Asia was probably 1972. My first trip to China was sometime in the late 70s, just when we first opened up, when you could only still go to the Canton Fair. And my first trip was for a store in New Orleans. My second trip was when I started working for May Department Stores, which owned the Heck Company, for international, to develop our international sourcing. I don't know what the percentage of clothes made in the U.S. was in the 70s, but my guess is it was well over 50%, because when I was a buyer, you know, I went to market and a lot of the companies were making in Pennsylvania. Now, today, only 3% of the clothes, and this is 5 years ago, only 3% of the clothes that are sold in America are made in America. The garment district, which used to be very vital, still has some, you know, apparel makers. I don't think there's anybody in Pennsylvania anymore making clothes, hardly. And recently I read that there's not even any denim made in this country anymore. So the mills are also, the fabric mills are also gone. I don't know how many millions of jobs have disappeared and, you know, haven't been replaced in some of these places by other things. You talk about Hickory, North Carolina versus Charlotte. So there are a lot of forces that, you know, bear on economics and economic policies, and with these massive disruptions that have happened, you know, because of globalization, because of technology developments. So if you can talk about what effect, maybe we go into this identity economics, and if you can talk about those effects on the economic policy, and this issue of what does the government do versus what does the government leave to free markets.
That's a big and really important question. Hopefully I can articulate this well. So, you know, we talked about markets versus government and how this was one of, you know, the debates about Keynes and the government's role in the economy, which was kind of defined the kind of big economic debates of the last 50 or 60 years. Well, another of the great debates was globalization, and it relates to the first debate. To the first debate. So, in the 1990s, when Yellen comes on the scene, kind of starting with Ronald Reagan, really, and then kind of carried forward from Bush to Clinton, there's a growing acceptance in the policy arenas, and a strengthening conviction in economics that globalization is good, and that global trade, in particular, is good. An idea that when two countries trade with each other, both sides end up better off. And this is an idea that goes all the way back to a 19th century economist named David Ricardo, who had an idea of comparative advantage. And so this idea really became a driving force in economic policy. So it started with the U.S. forming closer economic ties with Mexico through NAFTA. Now, the context at the time was, you know, we had increased our integration with Europe and with Japan, and those were disruptive experiences for some industries. It was certainly disruptive for the auto industry in Detroit, but what I think a lot of economists took from these periods was that despite the disruption, economic progress continued in the United States, and unemployment, you know, especially in the 90s after we opened up with Mexico, unemployment fell. We had one of the best decades we've had in years after bringing Mexico into the trade system. So it caused some disruptions in some industries and some communities, but the idea was that all in all, not only was the United States better off, but by spreading our values, our democratic values and our values of free markets to other countries, that the world would be better off too, and also more like us and less likely to confront us. militarily or otherwise. And so that argument won the day in the 1990s and was extended to China. And China was allowed into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Now, I should say, another part of this idea of global integration and trade integration was that it helped to keep inflation down. And, America was still wounded by inflation in the 1970s. And here's this approach you can take that keeps inflation low, keeps interest rates low, allows people to, take out cheaper mortgages, to buy new homes, increases home ownership. So there's all these ancillary benefits from low inflation and globalization. Well, China was different because China was so big and its labor force was so low wage that integration with China created disruption to American communities like Hickory, which I get into in this book, and into our manufacturing base that we hadn't seen before. And also drove inflation lower to levels we hadn't seen before. So China was a true and deep disruption to the American economy that, and we're still feeling the effects of it today. Now, I don't want to go on too long, but this kind of leads to two other issues. One is the identity economics, which we can talk about if you want. But the other is to come full circle to this idea of markets and government. And I think the China story and the Russia experience that we've had kind of lead us back to some really interesting conclusions about that story. I can keep talking, or we can.
No, I think the conclusions about the markets, and I think that's a very interesting point. So continue.
All right. Well, so the American idea, and just to bring Yellen into this, Yellen was a part of the economic consensus. She was for free trade. She supported it when she was, and by the way, Akerlof has joked that the only time he ever disagreed with his wife was in their discussions about the benefits and costs of free trade. So when she was the chair of the CEA in the late 90s, she wrote reports in support of the idea that the benefits of trade with Mexico outweighed the costs, and that the same would likely be true in the case of China. Well, so the idea was in the 1990s that if we bring Russia and China, these two communist or former communist superpowers, into our system, then, like I say, they'll become more like us. They'll embrace our kind of modes of democratic market capitalism. And obviously, what we've discovered in the last 20 years is that didn't happen. And we see this with Russia today, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We see this with our increasing alienation from the Chinese. This idea, and to me, the China part is almost shocking, because by embracing our market system and becoming a part of our market system, China was able to reduce poverty in its country by something like 700. It was the greatest poverty reduction program in the history of mankind. 700 million people were lifted from poverty, in large part because of trade with the Western world and the United States and global integration. And it's almost shocking to me to see that both Russia and China are now turning in a different direction. And this brings me back to this whole discussion about markets and democratic government. What I take from this story, where I end up, is that this idea of democratic, market-driven capitalism that we have, it's not easy, and it's not inevitable. And what we as a country have to do, and what our founders did when they created the United States, was work at the institutions that make it work. And the institutions those institutions didn't take hold in Russia and China, and that's why they're where they are today. In the United States, and by institutions, I mean our electoral systems, our banking system, our media, our regulatory system. what's disturbing right now is Americans don't trust these systems that hold this kind of. This is a book about two marriages. It's about Yellen's marriage to Akerlof, but also the marriage of capitalism and democracy. And people are losing faith in the functioning of those institutions. I think where Yellen's real place in history comes down is that, you know, she had kind of big dreams and goals of solving the problems of unemployment. At the end of the day, she was someone who was in there trying to keep these institutions working at a time when they were under assault. And she made some good calls and she's made some bad calls. But at the end of the day, I think that I think the country would benefit if we had more conversations about how do we keep the institutions strong and rebuild trust in them. Because what we have here, this special thing that we're always trying to balance between capitalism and democracy, it's a hard thing to do and you got to keep working at it.
So you talk about George Akerlof's theory of identity economics.
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated by Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and thinking slow.
Yeah.
Because I'm very focused on prejudice and how quickly we form opinions about other people. And it's been interesting to me after I live in Georgetown. For 2 years, I walked the streets of Georgetown. Now, all of a sudden, I'm back in New York, and I'm at 34th Street, I'm in Penn Station, I'm on the subway, and I'm fascinated by how fast I make decisions about who I'm looking at. And I think that affects women. So I'm about, image as it relates to women. But it goes back to the thinking fast and thinking slow. There's a part of your brain that makes immediate decisions, whether you are conscious of them or not, and there's a part of your brain that is slower thinking. So that led to behavioral economics, that we don't always make the most rational decision because there's these two parts of the brain. And we don't like to think slowly, we like to think fast. So, but Akerlof has taken it to another level, which is that we not only individually think fast and think slow
right.
and don't make the rational decisions, but as a group that we have, well, maybe group things. So talk about identity.
Yeah, Akerlof is just a fascinating guy. He always seems to be like 20 or 30 years ahead of everybody else and just putting his finger on something that's subtle but profound. So to make this point about identity economics, so the underlying point is that like economists tend to think of as markets as driven by individuals, by units of individuals. Every individual is making his or her own choice about buying a book or buying a nice top, and that we're all trying to maximize our utility as individuals. Akerlof's idea was that that humans are group animals, and they function in part based on how they see themselves fitting in within certain groups, and also how they see themselves fitting in opposition to other groups. So I'll go back a little bit and then come back to what this means today. So Akerlof has this fascinating lifelong friendship with an economist named Amartya Sen, who also won a Nobel Prize. They met each other during Akerlof's excursions to India in the 1960s. These two guys literally rewriting Enlightenment economics in Delhi in the 1960s. Amartya Sen grew up in post-colonial India, and he saw a country that had been held together almost overnight become torn apart by factionalism. When he was a little boy, he was Hindu, or lived in a Hindu neighborhood, and when he was a little boy, a man, a laborer, a day laborer, came barreling into his backyard with a knife in his back, bleeding everywhere. And it was a Muslim day laborer who was looking for work and showed up in a Hindu neighborhood. And somebody attacked him because they didn't think that a Muslim belonged looking for work in a Hindu neighborhood. And Amartya Sen kind of spent his life kind of haunted by this, the division that he saw in his own world, and he became friendly with Akerlof, and Akerlof started exploring it and modeling this idea that people behave as group animals, and that we see it in in many different ways, including gender and labor markets, right? So when Akerlof wrote his first paper on identity in the 1990s, he asked the question, well, why is it that women are more likely to be grade school teachers and men are more likely to be college professors when both undertakings involve teaching people? Or why is it that women are more likely to be nurses and men are more likely to be medical doctors when both, involve giving care to people? And why is it that women are more likely to be stay-at-home mothers and men are more likely to be in the workplace? And if you switch those roles, they all of a sudden start feeling friction in their new roles. So a man who stays as a stay-at-home father, and Akerlof actually experienced this because he would pick Robbie up from school at Berkeley, in Berkeley of all places, in the 1980s, and some of the other mothers thought he was unemployed. Why else would he be picking up his son in the middle of a workday? Or women, who were kind of working in high-level positions in law firms, for instance. Why is it that they felt that they got a sense that men felt threatened by them? So he developed this theory of identity economics, which is that people define themselves as in terms of how they fit in with groups, and that these groups often define themselves in opposition to each other. And he saw this in the 1990s, and he wrote a paper with one of his former students, a woman named Rachel Cranton, who now runs the social sciences department at Duke. And their model was a model of reds versus greens. So they just picked two colors. Because they didn't want, they originally said, well, let's just call it blacks versus whites. But then they said, no, there's too many racial undertones, so let's call it reds versus greens. And they did one of these models with all these Greek letters, and they kind of formulated kind of how this system works. And then lo and behold, here we are in the last 5 or 6 years, and our country has become a country of reds versus blues. And in many ways, we think about ourselves as standing for certain issues or certain things, but we're also kind of standing, when we take a stand on something, we're also signaling to people, who's in your group and who's out of your group. So the analogy I like to use is driving down a road. You see someone in a pickup truck with a big American flag hanging off the back. That's a red. That's a signal that's a red. You might drive down the same road and see someone in a VW Beetle with a rainbow bumper sticker. That's a blue. So there's like signaling that goes on in our day-to-day behavior, and there's an industry built around identity economics. There are all kinds of industries. If you get your news on Fox or MSNBC, you're in part going there to have your identity and your worldview and your belief systems kind of reinforced by the way the news is being told to you. So it turns out, I think, that, and for me, this is one of the most important learning experiences from reporting this book out, because I had already done a lot of writing about the monetary policy stuff, but learning about this idea of identity economics opened my eyes to kind of how these forces shape so much day-to-day life in America. And by the way, Robbie has become an economist whose specialty is identity economics. But I see how these forces are at play, and I also see how these forces of identity economics have the potential to undermine the very institutions that I was saying are so, like, why do we distrust each other so much? Well, we're being told to distrust each other every day as part of this kind of clash of reds versus blues. And that undermines faith in the media. It undermines faith in policing. It undermines faith in regulatory systems, you name it. So what I came to see from reporting this book is just how important this kind of idea of oppositional identity is in American life today, and how it works both ways. And like, you might be a blue who sees reds and sees them behaving this way without even thinking that the reds see you in the same oppositional way. So, I
have no idea what time it is, but what time is it?
It's
Okay, so I should let the audience, we can continue a little bit longer. I know Janet as a warm, unassuming, very funny person. And when she left the Fed, she sent me a text and said, you might want to watch this. And it was the New York Fed, and they'd all gotten together and they'd popped their collars. And then it spread to the San Francisco Fed, I don't know where else. How would you describe, and I've heard various stories about when she got to Treasury, that she really reached down into the ranks.
Yeah.
Talk about the human side of it.
I'll give you a couple of anecdotes, and I think the human side is really interesting because when you see her testifying up on Capitol Hill or answering questions on TV, it's what you see is student Janet. You know, the Janet who wants to have all of her answers right and has kind of thought it all through and could go longer than most humans' attention spans can tolerate. But behind the scenes, yeah, she is, I think, warm and funny. I'll give you two examples. One is, so last year was a pretty chaotic year in terms of managing the Treasury Department in an economy in a COVID and post-COVID environment. She spent the last few days before Christmas writing personal thank you notes to different groups in her building because she, in part because of what she learned from George and Robbie's work on identity, she wanted them to feel like they were part of an institution that had a larger purpose and that their work was kind of appreciated and recognized. So I think that was like just, you know, that was a pretty good example to me of the warmth. The humor, there's something that she just kind of blurted out, sticks in my mind when I went to see her and the family in Berkeley in August of 2021 for some interviews. And it was a very chaotic time. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, let's just say, wasn't going very well. And she was worried that there was going to be a debt ceiling crisis. This is these ritual battles that Republicans and Democrats have every 5, 6, 7 years about whether to agree to continue to borrow to fund deficits that they've already created. And so it was a very stressful time. And you know, she joked to me as I was walking out that she thought she was going to be the first Treasury Secretary to default on the debt and die of a heart attack. A little gallows humor. But they didn't default on the debt. And you know, there's been these rumors swirling around Washington that she would leave after the midterms. And you know, she told me a couple weeks ago in a story that I wrote in the Journal that she has no intention of leaving. She's planning on sticking around.
Okay, questions? Yes.
Go ahead. Yeah. If no one else was going to ask questions, I'm going to start asking questions. So, but we have one up here.
I have a few short questions. First of all, why Yellen and not another economic leader?
Why write about her?
Right. What is it that devoting an entire book is a lot of work?
Yeah.
And then what was it like collaborating with her, interviewing her? Was she as demanding of you as she is of herself?
Yeah. First of all, I wouldn't say we collaborated. I would say she cooperated. You know, I need to be careful about, and she needs to be careful about how that relationship works because you know I write for the Wall Street Journal about economics, and I don't think neither she nor I wanted to kind of get too cozy, but you know, I told her I wanted to write a book, and she cooperated, and it wasn't her only demand was that she be able to see quotes before I published any quotes in the book. I ended up not using many direct quotes from her, in part because I didn't want to get into that kind of that issue. So why Yellen? So she is clearly a historic figure, having served at the center of economic policy making in Washington for so long, really longer than anyone else. No one else of her generation has been in the center, on the bridge of the ship for so many consequential decisions. So that's putting aside whether she's a male or a female. She has been at the center of so much. Secondly, she broke glass ceilings. She broke every glass ceiling that was in front of her, and so I thought there was a story that people would want to read. And just reporting it for me was so eye-opening on what it was like in the 1970s, just like not that long ago. So that was an important story. It didn't occur to me that this was a story that people might want to read until I got the third piece of it in my head, which was her family life and the love story. So her relationship with George Akerlof and the path they traveled together and the different personalities they had really is what kind of made this something that I felt I could bring to life. And the fact that the two of them have been literally in the middle of every major economic debate of the last 60 years, they became, to me, it became more than just a book about one person. She and Akerlof became characters through which I could tell a story about the modern economy that was more than just a bunch of X's and O's, that was a bunch of effing people. Yeah.
More questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for writing a book about this glass ceiling breaker, Janet Yellen. I would put her along the lines over at the level of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in terms of...
And I hope someone makes a big movie about it.
About her, yes, several. I was thinking about another question that had occurred to me. We have this great economics writer for the Wall Street Journal, and we've just come off a very tough election. And it was all about inflation, inflation, inflation. That's all the people were going to be voting, their pocketbooks. It's the economy's stupid. And it turned out it went a different direction.
Yeah.
So as long as we have you here, can you give us your take on what happened to the pundits, what happened to the pollsters, and what, in your view, actually happened with this election related to,
Right.
Can you summarize the question?
Right. Okay. So the question is, let's talk about the most recent election. Some people were saying there was going to be a Republican wave or tsunami in which they took the House and the Senate. It doesn't appear that was the case. The first thing I'll say is I have a Sherlock Holmes answer to that question, which doesn't directly answer your question. But to me, what's most interesting about this election is the dog that didn't bark. And I was talking before about institutions, how people who care about this country are should and can focus on strengthening the institutions that hold democratic capitalism together. And one of those important institutions is our electoral systems, right? So after 2020, there was a great deal of upheaval around the election. Riots, allegations of fraud, everyone is familiar with that story. For me, what's most important about this election is what didn't happen. I'm not seeing stories about people being disrupted at the polls, not being allowed to vote, or lines going on for hours and hours and not getting in, allegations of fraud. I mean, there are still a few. There's still a Senate election that hasn't been determined. We don't know the course of whether who's going to control Senate as a result of it. But it feels to me a lot more orderly than the last one, and to me, that's the most important news of this election. The fact that it was orderly, because that's at that kind of core of our institutions and making sure they work. In terms of why the red wave didn't happen, I mean, I think you get these narratives that kind of come and go over the course of an election season, and I haven't looked at how well the polls did or didn't do. But a couple of months ago, people were saying it was going to turn out pretty much the way it turned out, that Republicans would take the House but not sweep it, and that the Senate was going to be a close call. So to me, it feels more like it looked like it might feel in August than it looked like it might feel in October, but I didn't feel like it was that off. And I think what the message I take from it is that yeah, I mean, inflation and the economy matter, but so do a lot of other things for people. Certainly, the abortion issue mattered for a lot of voters. And I think the story about election denial and candidates that embrace that idea also mattered in some of these races. So I heard, I can't remember who said it, but I heard someone on one of the cable channels say something useful, which was that this election demonstrated that people can hold, the American electorate can hold complex and conflicting ideas in their head and sort through them. So I think all of those things mattered in this case.
One more question. Yes.
You mentioned that, getting back to Janet Yellen, which I think was the topic, you mentioned that philosophically, at least, she came of age in the 1970s.
Yeah.
During the 1970s, well, it's long forgotten, there's no more Keynesian administration than the Nixon administration, with wage and price controls, most of employment legislation, a whole host of things, and the economic force behind that was George Shultz. Did she and Shultz ever interact?
I don't know much about her relationship with Shultz, if there is any relationship with Shultz. I am a bit skeptical of this idea that the Nixon years weren't Keynesian. I mean, Nixon did work very hard to stimulate the economy to get himself elected in '72. Oh, they were Keynesian. Oh, all right. Okay, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, and there's, there was a quote back then. I can't remember who said it. Someone in the room will remember that. We're all Keynesians now. So, but I knew Mike would know the answer. Who was it?
Yeah, it was Nixon.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Okay. So, yeah, I don't know about her relationship with Shultz. She's very much a Democrat and has served for Democrats. But one of the interesting passages for me in the book was Donald Trump's decision about whether to nominate her for a second term. And he really liked her. I got a chance to talk to him about that decision. I don't know if it was that he felt a connection because he was from Queens and she was from Brooklyn, and he felt they were she was on the home team. I don't know if it was because, as he said, he was a low interest rate guy. He's a real estate guy. He liked low interest rates to get the economy going. But I think she also, and this gets back to her personality, she's a respectful person. So when she sat in meetings with him, she didn't try to kind of one-up him or make him look bad. She kind of sat, he asked her questions, and she tried to give him straightforward and honest answers. And he gave her some serious consideration. His advisors didn't want her in the job because she's a Democrat, and they thought that she would interfere with their deregulatory agenda. But he really admired her. There was a rumor and reports going around that he had blurted out once to some of his advisors that he didn't think he should give her the job because she was too short for the job. So when I asked him if he had ever said that, he said, well, I think she's tall in spirit. So it's a charming thing to say.
Okay.
I think I don't know if you can take one others, but I saw someone ask.
Yes,
Following up on what you said about democracy and economics, and what the questioner said about 3% of our clothing now made in the U.S. How does the Fed or what are economists doing to look at that issue, that we let all those jobs and all those businesses and manufacturing bases go to other countries, how that's affecting us today?
Well, I think this is a defining time and a shift. So George Herbert Walker Bush talked about the New World Order. After the Berlin Wall fell and China started opening up. And this was, the idea was an order built on, connections among friendly cooperative countries and global trade. what I would say is we're now in a period of a new world disorder, and that we're now in a period of friction, confrontation. I'm not sure how far it'll go with China, certainly with Russia, and that's going to, that is already defining the world that we live in, and you feel it when you shop, because the New World Order kept inflation low for a long time. And the friction we're feeling now is in part because these global supply chains that were built during the era of the New World Order aren't working the way they used to. We've put up tariffs, the Chinese retaliated, they've had a zero COVID policy. Their policy of opening is clearly turning towards something else that's potentially very dark. So what are economists doing about it? I think the answer is, they're still figuring out. We don't have a paradigm for this new era. We had a paradigm for the New World Order. We don't have a paradigm for this. I think Yellen is a little kind of befuddled herself because the political forces are all turning towards confrontation with China. And I think most economists would still argue that, yes, there were the costs of engagement in trade with China were deeper than they had expected and hit some communities much, much harder than they had expected. But I think many economists with her worldview would argue that global engagement is still for the better, that we didn't manage it well last time, but it's still for the better. And so, people talk about reshoring, bringing jobs back here. That's a heavy lift for any kind. I would be interested in hearing your point of view, actually, about issues like sourcing and global trade, how that's shaping your own business.
And also environmental impact of this sourcing.
Which an environment is something that Janet was really. I mean, we make everything in New York City. We have one shirt that can't be made in the U.S., but we make everything in New York City. And you walk in the factories, and they're all basically Chinese immigrants, all over 50. So, while you could, there are ways to make the garment industry not as labor intensive, but no matter what you do, it's labor intensive. I was talking to somebody yesterday or this past week, who's in the auto supply parts in Michigan to the auto companies. She was talking about how many fewer cars they're making and whatever. I always thought that making chips was pretty automatic. That you could get robots to make chips, and then they said no, they're very labor intensive. Even though I think we're building two chip factories here in the U.S. They're very so it really depends on how much labor and what the cost of that labor is, because what's happening in the garment industry is that as China has put all these restrictions on and they're closing and whatever, and the cost of labor has gone up in China, they're moving to Vietnam.
Right.
What's next after Vietnam, I don't know. But this whole issue of globalization, while it keeps the prices down and in the total, it's better for everybody else. There are pockets of disruption, and how do you solve those pockets of disruption?
And they've been there for a long time. This is not a surprise. So that was why I was asking where are economists seeing that this began to happen decades ago. Now we have the current impact, which is bigger than ever.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, frankly, I think the profession was a little complacent and a little too locked into its view that trade is good, and didn't see how powerful these disruptions could be, and the policymakers didn't really give much thought into how, if we're going to go down this route, what do you do to help people? The idea was that, well, people will retrain. They'll do what's in their interest. They'll get retrained and then go work somewhere else, or they'll move. Well, it turns out, I looked a lot in Hickory, North Carolina, which was the furniture manufacturing capital of the country. It turned out a lot of people working in these plants never got out of high school. They didn't really have good reading or writing skills. And you're going to tell them to go back to community college and learn how to become a phlebotomist or something. And that some of the ones who did, the wages were 20-30% lower than they had been at the factory. So it was a tidal wave in some communities, and that helps to explain why we did have a red wave in 2020. People were fed up. They said they said the elites in Washington and in the media and on Wall Street don't care about us, and we're going to poke them in the eye, and that's exactly what they did.
So I think we should, okay, so for those of you who haven't read this book, it answers a lot of questions, and of course it raises other questions, but I highly recommend it. So thank you, John.
Thank you.